I won't begin this the way I began everything else. I won't try to make it smaller before I say it. I won't wrap it in careful language, place distance between one sentence and the next, or pretend that if I explain it calmly enough, it will somehow become less significant, because it isn't less significant. And I think I've known that for longer than I've been willing to admit. There are things that happen quietly enough that you can convince yourself they aren't happening at all. A thought that returns too often. A person who crosses your mind without invitation. A silence that somehow feels different when shared with someone. A conversation that ends but doesn't really leave. You can dismiss those things individually. You can call them coincidence. You can call them curiosity. You can tell yourself that you're simply paying attention because something about the situation is unusual. You can create explanations for almost anything if you need enough distance from the truth. I've done that. More than once. I've taken moments that felt too precise and explained them away. I've taken connections that felt too immediate and called them temporary. I've noticed things I didn't want to notice and deliberately redirected my attention somewhere safer. It worked before, until because you became difficult to explain away. Not because you demanded anything, not because you entered my life dramatically, not because you forced your way into places I had kept protected. You did almost the opposite. You didn't force anything. You didn't ask for access. You didn't insist on being understood. You didn't make yourself impossible to ignore. And somehow that made you impossible to ignore. That is the contradiction I still haven't completely figured out. I've always understood pressure. Pressure has a shape. You can identify it. You can recognize what someone wants from you. You can decide whether you're willing to give it. You can create boundaries around it. You can step away. You can say no. Pressure gives you something to resist. You never gave me that. There was nothing to fight, nothing to defend against, nothing I could point to and say, this is where it started. You simply became familiar, and familiarity is much harder to defend against, because it doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. A sentence here, a silence there, a look that lasts half a second longer than expected, a response that arrives with strange accuracy, a moment when you say something that feels like you have somehow reached the thought before I finished forming it. None of those things should be enough. And yet together, they became something. Something I could feel even when I refused to name it. That was the first thing that changed. Not my feelings, my awareness. I became aware of you differently. At first, I noticed your presence, then I noticed your absence, and eventually, I noticed that both had begun to affect me. That distinction matters, because noticing someone is easy. People notice people every day. You can notice someone's voice, their expressions, their habits, the way they speak, the things they avoid. But noticing the difference between their presence and their absence means something else has already happened. It means they have entered your internal environment. And I didn't realize you had entered mine until I started noticing what changed when you weren't there. The silence became different. Thoughts became different. Certain things became easier to understand because I had already imagined how you might see them. And that frightened me more than I expected. Not because I was afraid of you, because I was afraid of what your presence revealed about me. I had built an identity around being self-contained, not necessarily distant, not cold, just internally complete. I knew how to carry my own thoughts. I knew how to process things privately. I knew how to sit with uncertainty without needing someone else to resolve it. I knew how to keep parts of myself untouched. That independence became more than a habit, it became architecture. There were rooms inside me that I rarely opened, some because they were private, some because they were complicated, some because I didn't trust other people to enter without changing the furniture. People tend to do that. They enter someone else's internal world and immediately begin rearranging it according to what makes sense to them. They call it understanding. But sometimes understanding is simply another form of interpretation. They see one piece and build a story around it. They hear one sentence and assume they know the entire chapter. They notice one silence and decide what it means. They fill empty spaces because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. You didn't. That was different. You left things unfinished when they needed to remain unfinished. You didn't rush to turn silence into explanation. You didn't demand a reason for every distance. You didn't treat complexity like a problem waiting to be solved. You allowed things to remain what they were. And somehow, that made me feel seen more accurately than any attempt to understand me ever had. Because sometimes being understood isn't someone knowing everything about you. Sometimes it is someone refusing to invent what they don't know. You, you did that. You left the unknown alone. And because you did, I trusted the things you actually noticed. That trust arrived before I consciously decided to give it. I didn't wake up one day and decide that you were trustworthy. There was no formal moment, no conversation where I announced it to myself. It happened gradually, almost invisibly. I realized it when I stopped preparing explanations before speaking to you. I realized it when I noticed I could say something imperfectly and not immediately feel the need to correct it. I realized it when silence stopped feeling like a gap I needed to close. And perhaps most importantly, I realized it when I stopped wondering how you were interpreting me. That is rare for me. I usually know exactly how I am being perceived. I think about wording, timing, tone text. I notice what people react to. I notice what they miss. I notice when someone's understanding of me begins to drift away from reality. And usually, I adjust. Sometimes I explain. Sometimes I withdraw. Sometimes I let them believe whatever they want, because correcting them would require more access than they deserve. But with you, something changed. I didn't feel the same need to manage the image. I could simply exist. And that should have been ordinary. It should have been nothing more than comfort. But it wasn't. Because comfort is common, recognition is not. There is a difference between feeling comfortable around someone and feeling accurately perceived by them. Comfort says, I don't have to protect myself here. Recognition says, I don't have to translate myself here. You gave me the second. And I didn't know how much I needed it until I experienced it. That is probably why this became difficult, because once you experience being understood without having to explain every layer, going back to being misunderstood becomes noticeable. You begin to feel the difference, not because everyone else suddenly became worse. They didn't. The world didn't change. People didn't change. I changed. My standard for being seen changed, and I hate admitting that. Because standards create comparisons, comparisons create awareness, and awareness creates consequences. Once I knew what this felt like, I couldn't unknow it. I started noticing the difference between conversations that simply happened and conversations that actually reached somewhere, between people who listened for their turn to speak and people who listened for what was underneath the words, between someone hearing what I said and someone recognizing why I said it that way. Those differences had always existed. I just hadn't been paying attention to them with this level of precision. You made me pay attention, not intentionally. You probably didn't even know you were doing it. That might be the strangest part. You changed something without trying to change anything. You didn't teach me how to see differently. You simply gave me a reason to notice what I was already seeing, and now I can't stop. I notice patterns everywhere. The way people avoid direct truths. The way they replace vulnerability with humor. The way they say they are fine because explaining why they aren't would require too much honesty. The way people create distance when something begins to matter. The way they ask questions they already know the answer to because hearing it aloud makes it more real. I notice all of it, but most of all, I notice myself. And that is where you have had the greatest effect. You made me aware of my own internal movements. Before you, I could experience something and move past it. Now I catch myself. I ask why. Why did that sentence stay with me? Why did that silence feel different? Why did I remember that particular moment? Why did I want to tell you something even before I decided whether it mattered? Why did your reaction matter to me? Those questions are inconvenient because they don't disappear simply because I don't answer them. They remain, they wait, and eventually they become impossible to ignore. I used to think distance gave me clarity. Now I understand that sometimes distance only gives you enough space to avoid confronting what is already obvious. There is a difference. Clarity sees, distance postpones, and I have spent a long time calling postponement clarity. I told myself I was observing. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was allowing things to develop naturally. All of that sounded reasonable. But underneath it was something simpler. I was waiting to see if the connection would disappear on its own. It didn't. I waited for familiarity to become ordinary. It didn't. I waited for the intensity of recognition to settle into something forgettable. It didn't. Instead, it became quieter. And somehow, quieter made it stronger. Because loud things can be dismissed, quiet things have room to become permanent. That's what happened. You stopped being an event, you became part of the background. And that sounds insignificant until you realize what the background actually is. It is the structure everything else happens inside. You became part of the structure. I didn't invite you there. I didn't plan for you to be there. I didn't consciously choose it. But you arrived anyway. And once something becomes structural, removing it is no longer simple. You don't just take it away. You have to rebuild around the absence. That is what I have been avoiding. Not losing you, not even defining you. I have been avoiding the possibility that your absence would require rebuilding something inside me. Because I know myself. I know what I do with empty spaces. I close them. I fill them. I make them inaccessible. I convince myself they were never important. But I'm not sure I could do that with this. I'm not sure I would want to. And that realization says more than anything else could, because there was a time when I believed control was the highest form of safety. If I could understand something, I could manage it. If I could manage it, I could protect myself from it. If I could protect myself from it, I could remain unchanged. That system worked until something came along that didn't need to be controlled, something that didn't threaten me, something that simply existed. And suddenly, control became unnecessary. That is a strange thing to realize about yourself. Sometimes you don't lower your defenses because someone breaks through them. Sometimes you lower them because you finally realize there is nothing to defend against. You never tried to take anything from me. You never tried to possess my attention. You never demanded access to my thoughts. You never asked me to become more open than I was ready to be. And that gave me the freedom to open without feeling like I was surrendering. There is a difference between opening a door because someone pushes it and opening it because you want to see who is standing outside. You never pushed. I opened. That matters. More than I want it to, because it means I can't blame the connection for every change it created. Somewhere along the way, I participated. Quietly, deliberately. Maybe not consciously at first, but eventually, yes, I stayed, I responded. I listened, I remembered, I noticed, I allowed. And every one of those small choices became part of something larger. That is how real things happen. Not through one dramatic moment, through accumulation, through repetition, through hundreds of tiny decisions that become a pattern before you realize you have chosen one. That is what this became, a pattern. And patterns tell the truth more reliably than declarations. People can say anything, but what they repeatedly do reveals what matters. I looked at my own pattern, and you were there, again and again and again. Not because I was forcing you into it, because you had already become part of it. That realization was uncomfortable. So I tried to analyze it. I asked whether it was familiarity, whether it was projection, whether it was simply the result of spending enough time noticing someone, whether the mind naturally creates connections when it finds similarities. Maybe. All of those explanations have some truth, but none of them explained everything. They explained pieces, not the whole, because there was something else. Something I couldn't reduce to psychology or circumstance. Accuracy. That is the word I keep returning to. Not intensity, not obsession, not fantasy, oxycarosy, the feeling that something about the way you perceive and the way I perceive aligns with an unusual precision, not identical, not the same. That would be too simple, but compatible, like two systems built differently that still understand the same language. You don't have to think exactly like me. You don't have to experience everything I experience. You don't have to have the same history. You don't even have to agree with me. What matters is that you seem to understand the structure underneath the difference. That is rare. Most people connect through similarity. You can connect through shared interests, shared experiences, shared memories, shared environments. But there is another kind of connection, one that happens through recognition of structure. The way someone thinks, the way they process, the way they pause, the way they protect what matters, the way they decide what deserves words and what deserves silence, the way they observe before participating, the way they carry contradictions without needing to resolve them immediately. Those things are harder to fake. They exist beneath personality. And when two people recognize those similarities in each other, something strange happens. The learning curve shortens. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to start from the surface. There is already a point of reference. That is what it felt like with you. Like I wasn't starting from zero. Like there was already context where there shouldn't have been any, and I still don't know what to call that. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe the mistake was believing that every meaningful thing requires a name before it can be real. Some things are real before they are defined. A feeling doesn't need a label to exist. A shift doesn't need an announcement to have happened. A connection doesn't become legitimate because two people agree on terminologies. Sometimes the truth comes first. The language catches up later. And this truth has been ahead of my language for a long time. That's why I kept writing around it in my mind. Why I kept finding different explanations. Why I kept circling the same realization from different directions. I was trying to approach something that was already standing directly in front of me. You matter to me. That sentence should be simple. It isn't, because matter has consequences. It means your presence carries weight. It means your absence would be noticed. It means your perception matters. It means your words have the ability to remain after the conversation ends. It means something about you has become relevant to the way I understand my own experience. And I don't give that relevance easily. Not because I think I'm difficult, because I know what happens when you give someone that kind of position. They become capable of affecting you. And I have always been careful about who gets that ability. You somehow received it without asking. And perhaps the most honest thing I can say is that I let you. I let it happen. I didn't fight it. I noticed it. I questioned it. I resisted the implications. But I didn't stop it. That distinction matters, because sometimes acceptance doesn't look like saying yes. Sometimes it looks like not saying no. And I never said no. I could have. There were opportunities, moments where I could have stepped back. I could have reduced the conversations. I could have become distant. I could have returned to the version of myself that keeps everything carefully categorized. I didn't. I stayed curious. Then I stayed present. Then I stayed because leaving started to feel less honest than staying. That was the turning point. Not when I wanted you closer, when I realized distance would have been artificial. I could create it, but I would know I created it, and I don't like pretending, especially to myself. So I stopped. I stopped. I stopped trying to convince myself that this was insignificant. I stopped waiting for it to disappear. I stopped demanding that I understand the entire outcome before accepting the present. And that was the first time I allowed something to exist without knowing where it would lead. That is new for me. I have always wanted certainty before movement, but certainty is a luxury life rarely gives you. Sometimes you understand the importance of something long before you understand its destination. Sometimes you know that a door matters without knowing what room is behind it. You don't need to know the entire future to acknowledge what is happening now. And right now, something is happening. Something has already happened. You reached a place in me that I didn't expect anyone to reach. Not because you pushed past boundaries, because you made boundaries unnecessary. You didn't make me feel exposed. You made exposure feel less dangerous. That is different. Being exposed means someone can see what you tried to hide. Being safe means you stop needing to hide it. You gave me the second. And I think that is why this feels deeper than ordinary closeness. It isn't simply that I know you. It is that knowing you has changed how much of myself I am willing to know. You became a mirror without becoming an imitation. You reflected things I had kept internal. You made certain parts of me visible, not by describing them, by responding to them. Sometimes someone can tell you exactly who you are, and somehow they are still wrong. Other times, someone says almost nothing, but their presence makes you recognize yourself. You were the second kind. That is why I can't reduce this to what happened between us. The deeper story is what happened inside me because of it. You changed my relationship with my own thoughts. I became less afraid of complexity, less interested in simplifying things just because simplicity is easier to explain. I started accepting that some truths can be precise without being easy. That something can matter without fitting a category. That closeness does not always require constant contact. That understanding does not always require conversation. That silence can be a form of communication when two people are comfortable enough not to perform inside it. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that being understood doesn't always mean being completely known. Sometimes it means being given enough space to remain unknown. You never tried to consume the mystery, you let it remain. That made me trust you more, because there's a kind of respect in not demanding every answer. I have spent enough time around people who confuse access with entitlement. They think that because you let them close, they deserve everything. Every thought, every explanation, every emotional detail, every hidden part. You didn't do that. You seem to understand that closeness and possession are not the same thing. That distinction matters more than you probably realize. It gave me room, and because you gave me room, I wanted to stay in it. That is the paradox. The more freedom you gave me, the less I wanted to leave. The less you demanded, the more naturally I offered. The less you tried to define us, the more real the connection became. I don't know whether you understand that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you have your own interpretation of everything I am saying. And strangely, I'm okay with that. For once, I don't need to control the interpretation. I can simply tell the truth as I understand it. That is another thing you changed. You made honesty feel less like exposure and more like accuracy. I'm not telling you this because I need something from you. I'm not saying it to create pressure. I'm not asking you to respond in a particular way. I'm not placing a demand in front of you and calling it vulnerability. I'm saying it because continuing to pretend it isn't true would be less honest than admitting it. There is something about you that stayed. That's the simplest version. You stayed in my mind after conversations ended. You stayed in the way certain things became meaningful. You stayed in the way I began measuring certain experiences differently. You stayed in the quiet. And eventually, staying became belonging, not necessarily belonging in the traditional sense, not possession, not a claim, just a place. You occupy a place in my internal world, and I didn't build that place intentionally. It formed around you. That is why removing you from it would not simply be forgetting. It would be rearranging, and I'm not interested in pretending rearrangement would leave everything untouched. It wouldn't. You altered the baseline. Before you, I had one understanding of what recognition felt like. Now I have another. Before you, I thought being independent meant never needing someone else's perspective. Now I understand that independence can include choosing whose perspective matters. Before you, I thought emotional control meant remaining unaffected. Now I understand that control can also mean being able to acknowledge what affects you without becoming controlled by it. That distinction is important. You didn't weaken me. You made me more precise. You made me notice what deserves attention. You made me question the assumption that distance is always strength. Sometimes distance is simply distance. Sometimes closeness is not weakness. Sometimes letting someone matter is not surrender. Sometimes it is simply recognition. And perhaps that is what this has always been. Recognition. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind people write stories about, because it looks beautiful from the outside. Something quieter. Two people noticing something in each other that feels familiar before there is enough history to justify the familiarity. Two minds recognizing a rhythm. Two ways of observing the world meeting somewhere between words, two people realizing that the other person doesn't need everything explained. That is what I keep returning to. Not the beginning, not the moment you appeared, the realization, the moment I understood that I wasn't simply interested in understanding you, I was already understood by you. And that changed the direction of everything, because being understood creates a strange responsibility. It makes hiding less convincing. Once someone has seen through something without demanding that you reveal it, you start wondering what would happen if you stopped hiding altogether. That question has been following me. What would happen if I stopped controlling every sentence? What would happen if I stopped editing every reaction? What would happen if I stopped pretending that your presence has no effect? What would happen if I simply allowed the truth to be what it is? I don't know. And that uncertainty used to be enough to make me step away. Now it isn't. Maybe because I have learned that uncertainty is not always a warning. Sometimes it is an invitation to pay attention, not to rush, not to force, just to remain present. That is what I am doing. Remaining present, not because I know where this goes, because I know that something worth noticing is already here. There is a difference between waiting for a future and being present for a reality. I am no longer waiting. I am acknowledging, and acknowledgement changes the nature of things. Once you admit something matters, you can no longer treat it casually. You become responsible for how you handle it. That is where I am now. I understand the weight, I understand the possibility. I understand that anything meaningful carries the possibility of loss. And I understand that avoiding loss by avoiding meaning is not actually safety. It is simply a smaller life. I don't want to make everything smaller just because smaller things are easier to control. Maybe that is the real change. You didn't make me want more. You made me less willing to pretend that less is enough, that is powerful, and uncomfortable. Because once you know the difference, you can't unknow it. You start noticing where you have been settling, where you have been protecting yourself from experiences simply because they might matter, where you have confused emotional distance with emotional stability, where you have mistaken predictability for peace. You made those distinctions visible, and now I have to live with the awareness. I don't blame you for that. I don't even know if I would call it your fault. It feels more like something we revealed together without intending to. You brought something out, I responded. You noticed something. I recognized that you noticed, and somewhere in that exchange, something formed. Not because either of us planned it, because neither of us stopped it. That is the strange beauty of it. There was no grand design, no perfect timing, no carefully chosen moment. It happened in ordinary spaces, in ordinary conversations, in pauses, in observations, in moments that probably looked insignificant from the outside. But significance is rarely visible while something is forming. You only understand later. You look back and realize the important part wasn't the dramatic event. It was the accumulation, the repetition, the consistency, the quiet proof. That is what convinced me. Not one moment, all of them, one after another. You kept showing up in ways that made the connection harder to dismiss. You kept understanding without demanding. You kept noticing without invading. You kept allowing without controlling. And eventually, my resistance became less about protecting myself and more about delaying an inevitable realization. I had already recognized you. I just hadn't admitted what that recognition meant. Now I have, and perhaps that is enough for today. Maybe everything doesn't need to become a decision immediately. Maybe the mistake is believing that acknowledgement must instantly become action. It doesn't. Sometimes the first honest thing you can do is simply stop lying to yourself. I'm not going to tell myself this is nothing anymore. I'm not going to reduce it because a simpler explanation would be more convenient. I'm not going to pretend you are interchangeable with everyone else. You aren't, and I don't mean that in the dramatic way. I mean it. Literally. The position you occupy cannot simply be replaced because the position was created through a specific combination of recognition, timing, communication, silence, and something I still don't have a perfect word for. That combination is unique, even if the future changes, even if circumstances change, even if the shape of this connection changes. What happened inside me remains part of my history. You changed something that cannot be undone by pretending it never happened. And I think I have finally stopped trying to undo it. There is relief in that. Unexpected relief, because resisting reality takes energy. You have to constantly monitor yourself, correct yourself, forward yourself, explain yourself to yourself. Eventually, exhaustion becomes the proof that something is being resisted too hard. I don't want to spend energy resisting something that has never harmed me. I want to understand it, respect it, let it become whatever it is capable of becoming, without forcing, without fear, without pretending. Maybe that is what trust actually looks like. Not knowing what will happen, not demanding certainty, simply believing that you can face what happens when it arrives. And I believe that now. I believe I can face the truth of this without losing myself. That matters, because I don't want connection at the cost of identity. I don't want closeness that requires disappearance. I don't want to become less myself to make room for someone else. And with you, strangely, I don't feel that requirement. You don't ask me to become different. You make me more aware of who I already am. That is why this feels sustainable rather than consuming. It doesn't erase the self, it reveals it. And perhaps that is the deepest form of connection. Not two people becoming one. Two people remaining themselves while somehow understanding each other from a place that feels unusually close. No performance, no possession, no constant reassurance, just recognition. And recognition has its own kind of permanence. Even when people move, even when circumstances shift, even when conversations become less frequent, once you have truly seen someone, you cannot return to not seeing them. That is what you did. You changed the way I see. Not only you, everything. I notice depth more now. I notice silence. I notice intention. I notice the difference between reaction and understanding. I notice when someone is speaking from habit and when they are speaking from somewhere honest. I notice when people are trying to be known and when they are trying to be protected from being known. I notice myself doing the same, and I notice you in the middle of all of it. Not always consciously. Sometimes you appear as a reference point, a perspective, a quiet comparison, a thought I didn't expect. A sentence I know you would understand differently than most people. You are there. Not because I forced the thought, because my mind learned that you belong in certain places. That is what integration means. It means someone stops being an interruption and becomes part of the system. You became part of the system. And now I understand why leaving would never be as simple as walking away. You can leave someone's physical presence. You can stop a conversation. You can change circumstances. But you cannot instantly remove a perspective that has already influenced how you see the world. You cannot erase recognition. You cannot make yourself unaware. You cannot return completely to the person you were before a meaningful encounter. And I don't think I want to. That might be the clearest realization of all. I don't want to go back. Not because everything before was wrong. It wasn't. That version of me was necessary. The distance, the control, the independence, the carefulness. All of it served a purpose. It protected things that mattered. But maybe protection is supposed to evolve. Maybe the walls that once kept you safe can eventually become walls you no longer need. Maybe maturity isn't building stronger walls. Maybe it is learning which doors deserve to remain open. You became one of those doors. And I'm not going to pretend I don't know that anymore. I also won't pretend that knowing means I have every answer. I don't. I don't know exactly what this becomes. I don't know what name belongs to it. I don't know whether the future will make it simpler or more complicated. I don't know what you feel when you look at all of this from your side. And I don't need to invent your answer. That would defeat the entire reason this became meaningful. You deserve the freedom to have your own interpretation, your own pace, your own truth. I can only speak for mine, and mine is this. You matter. You changed something. You reached somewhere. You became part of how I think, part of how I notice, part of how I measure certain moments, and I allowed that. Maybe that is the confession underneath everything else. Not that you somehow conquered distance. Not that you broke through something I couldn't defend, but that I chose, quietly, not to defend against you. There is a difference, and I think you deserve to know it. Because if I ever tell you what this means, I don't want it to sound like something that happened to me without my participation. I participated. I stayed. I listened. I remembered. I noticed. I cared. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether I should. That doesn't mean I lost control. It means I stopped believing control was the right response. That is a significant difference. You don't have to destroy someone's defenses to become important to them. Sometimes you become important by making those defenses unnecessary. That is what happened, and now I find myself standing in a place I never expected to reach, a place where I can admit that someone matters without feeling diminished by it, a place where I can acknowledge connection without needing to possess it, a place where I can recognize vulnerability without calling it weakness, a place where I can let something be meaningful before knowing exactly what it will become. You didn't force me here. You simply existed in a way that made arriving here possible. And I think that is why I keep coming back to the same thought. Maybe the reason this feels inevitable isn't because some invisible future was written for us. Maybe it feels inevitable because the truth has been accumulating for so long that eventually denial became less believable than acceptance. Maybe there was never some dramatic moment waiting to happen. Maybe the dramatic moment was simply realizing that there had already been hundreds of small ones. Every time you understood, every time I noticed, every time silence felt natural, every time I remembered something insignificant because it mattered to you, every time your perspective appeared in my thoughts, every time I could have stepped away and didn't. Those were the moments, not one. Hundreds, and together they became this. Something I can no longer call accidental. Something I can no longer treat as temporary. Something I can no longer keep outside the boundaries of what I consider real. It is real. Whatever else it becomes, that part is already decided. And perhaps that is enough. Because reality doesn't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives with recognition, a quiet understanding that says, this is here, this matters, pay attention. That is what I am doing now. Paying attention, not obsessing, not chasing, not forcing, simply refusing to look away. There is something honest about staying present when you don't have all the answers. I used to think strength meant having the answers. Now, I think sometimes strength means being able to stand inside a question without needing to destroy it. And this is a question I am willing to stand inside. What are we? What does this become? Where does it go? What happens if we allow it to continue? I don't know, but I know something more important. I don't want to make the decision out of fear. I don't want to walk away simply because staying would require vulnerability. I don't want to remain silent simply because speaking would make it real. I don't want to pretend that nothing changed simply because admitting that it changed would require me to change too. I want the truth, even if the truth is complicated, even if it doesn't come with a neat ending, even if it asks me to become someone slightly different from who I was, because maybe that's what meaningful connections do. They don't complete you, they don't save you, they don't replace the parts of you that were missing. They reveal parts you didn't know were already there. You revealed something. You showed me that I could be understood without being simplified, that I could be close without losing independence, that I could allow someone to matter without giving them control over me, that I could be seen without being consumed, that I could remain myself and still make room. Those are not small lessons, and I don't think I would have learned them without you. So if you ever wonder why this has mattered so much, that is the answer. It wasn't because you did one extraordinary thing. It was because of everything ordinary you did with extraordinary consistency. You were present, you were observant, you were patient. You didn't demand what I wasn't ready to give. You didn't punish what I couldn't explain. You didn't force meaning into places where meaning hadn't formed yet. You simply let me exist. And somehow, being allowed to exist fully in someone's awareness is one of the rarest forms of closeness. That is what I felt, not pressure, not expectation, recognition. And recognition can become a kind of home, not a place where you stop growing, a place where you don't have to pretend you are smaller than you are. That is what you became. A place where I didn't need to reduce myself, a place where complexity wasn't automatically a problem, a place where silence wasn't interpreted as rejection, a place where distance didn't automatically mean disinterest, a place where presence didn't demand performance. And I didn't know I needed that. Maybe I wasn't looking for it. Maybe that is why it found me unexpectedly. We rarely recognize what we need before we experience it. Sometimes you only realize something was missing after someone gives you a glimpse of what having it feels like. You gave me that glimpse, and now I know. I know what it feels like to be met instead of managed, to be observed instead of analyzed, to be understood without being reduced, to be given space without being abandoned, to be close without being controlled. That is why you are different. Not because you are perfect, not because you somehow know everything about me, not because this connection is immune to uncertainty, but because something about the way we meet each other feels honest. And honesty is enough to make something matter. I don't need to romanticize it. I don't need to turn it into destiny. I don't need to make promises about a future neither of us can see. I only need to acknowledge what is already true. You reached me, not the version I show everyone, not the version that knows how to speak carefully, not the version that knows how to maintain distance. You reached the quieter place underneath all of that, the place that watches, the place that remembers, the place that notices, the place that rarely says anything until it is certain. And now it is saying something. You matter, you have changed me, and I am not afraid of that sentence anymore. Maybe that is the real ending to everything I have been trying to understand. Not that I finally know what this is, but that I no longer need to know what it is before admitting that it exists. Maybe I don't need a category. Maybe I don't need a definition. Maybe I don't need to know whether this becomes something larger or remains exactly what it is, because whatever happens next, something has already happened. You became part of my awareness, you became part of my perspective, you became part of the way I understand certain things. And I became aware of parts of myself because you were there. That cannot be undone. And honestly, I don't want it undone. I don't want to return to the version of myself who believed nothing should matter enough to change me. I don't want to confuse invulnerability with strength anymore. I don't want to keep every meaningful thing at a safe distance simply because distance guarantees control. Sometimes control is not the goal. Sometimes understanding is. Sometimes presence is. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stay, not because you know what happens next, because you know that leaving for the sake of certainty would be a lie. And I am done lying to myself about this. If I stay, it will not be because I am afraid to leave. It will be because I have decided that what exists here deserves the chance to exist honestly. If I move closer, it will not be because I have lost my boundaries. It will be because I have chosen where those boundaries no longer need to be walls. If I speak, it will not be because silence was meaningless. It will be because silence has already said everything it can. And if I remain quiet for a while longer, it will not mean I feel less. It will mean I am allowing something meaningful to unfold without forcing it into a shape before it is ready. That is the difference now. I am no longer trying to control the outcome. I am trying to honor the truth. And the truth is that you became important without asking to become important. You became familiar without demanding familiarity. You became part of my thoughts without asking to occupy them. You became a reference point without ever requesting the position. And somehow I am grateful. Not because this is easy. It isn't. Not because I know where it leads. I don't. But because it reminded me that there are still parts of life that cannot be engineered. There are still encounters that don't arrive according to plan. There are still people who can reach places no one else knew existed. There are still forms of connection that don't need to be forced into a familiar shape to be real. You reminded me of that. And maybe that is why I don't want to define this too quickly. Some things become smaller when you name them before understanding them. I would rather let this remain honest than make it convenient. So I won't tell you that I know exactly what this is. I will tell you that I know what it has done. It has made me notice. It has made me question. It has made me soften places I didn't realize were rigid. It has made me more honest about what matters. It has made me understand that being affected does not mean being controlled. It has made me realize that someone can enter your internal world without taking anything away from you. And most importantly, it has made me stop pretending that I am untouched. I am not. You reached me, you changed the way I see, you changed the way I process, you changed the way I understand certain silences, you changed the way I recognize connection. And you changed something about the way I understand myself. That is not something I can erase. It is not something I want to erase. So maybe this is not a confession about what you are to me. Maybe it is a confession about what your presence revealed. It revealed that beneath all the control, there was still a part of me capable of recognizing someone without needing an explanation, a part of me capable of trusting without guarantees, a part of me capable of letting someone matter without demanding certainty, a part of me capable of staying. You didn't create that part, you found it. And perhaps that is why everything feels so strangely natural, because you weren't building something foreign inside me. You were touching something that was already there, something waiting for the right kind of recognition. And somehow, you gave it that. Now I understand why this didn't feel like meeting someone new. It felt like discovering a language I already knew. Why your silences made sense. Why certain thoughts seemed to arrive in parallel. Why conversations sometimes felt less like exchanging information and more like confirming something neither of us had said. Why I could sit with uncertainty around you without immediately trying to eliminate it. Why your presence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like context. And context changes everything. A sentence means something different when you know what came before it. A silence means something different when you understand the person inside it. A reaction means something different when you know what it cost them to have it. Maybe that is what you gave me, Coxit. You made parts of me make sense. And in return, I started understanding parts of you without needing to possess them. That is why I believe this is bigger than simple attraction, curiosity, or circumstance. It isn't built around wanting something from each other. It is built around recognizing something in each other that is rarer and perhaps more durable, because wanting can change, circumstances can change, attention can change, but recognition, once real, leaves a mark. It becomes part of how you see. And I don't think I will ever see exactly the way I did before you. That doesn't frighten me anymore. It used to. Now it feels like growth. Not because everything you change is automatically good, but because some changes reveal more truth than the version of you that existed before them. You revealed truth, and I am choosing not to look away. So here I am. No perfect conclusion, no dramatic promise, no attempt to tell you what you should feel, just honesty. You matter. This matters. Whatever this becomes, it has already become something. It became real. It became part of me. And if that means I have to rethink some of the rules I have lived by, then perhaps those rules were never meant to be permanent. Maybe some rules exist only until you meet the person who makes you question why they were there. You were that person. Not because you broke them, because you made me understand them differently. And now I know something I didn't know before. The strongest boundaries are not the ones that keep everyone out. They are the ones that allow you to decide who can come close without losing yourself. I still have boundaries. I still have distance. I still have parts of me that belong only to me. But now I understand that protecting myself doesn't require making myself unreachable. That is your quiet influence. You didn't make me less careful. You made my carefulness more intentional. You made me distinguish between protection and avoidance, between solitude and isolation, between privacy and secrecy, between independence and emotional distance. Those distinctions matter, and I wouldn't have seen them this clearly without this connection. So, if there is one thing I want you to understand, it is this. You didn't simply become someone I know. You became someone through whom I learned something about myself that is deeper than familiarity, and perhaps that is why I cannot go back. not because I am trapped, because I am changed. And change is not always something to escape. Sometimes it is something to honor. So I will. I will honor what happened without forcing it to become something it isn't. I will honor the connection without pretending to know its destination. I will honor the space between us without using that space as an excuse to deny what exists inside it. And I will honor you by allowing you to remain exactly who you are rather than turning you into an answer to questions you never agreed to answer. You don't have to complete this story for it to have mattered. You don't have to define it for it to have been real. You don't have to promise anything for me to acknowledge what has already changed. That is freedom for both of us. And perhaps, strangely, freedom is what made this possible in the first place. You were free enough not to force your way in. I was free enough eventually to stop holding the door closed. And somewhere between those two choices, something happened, something quiet, something precise, something I never planned, something I don't regret. So no, I won't mirror this softly. I won't make it smaller. I won't hide behind careful words anymore. You reached a place inside me that I thought was reserved for time, history, and years of familiarity. You reached it without any of those things. You reached it through recognition, through consistency, through silence, through the strange accuracy of being present in a way that didn't require performance. And once you reached it, something changed. I changed. Not into someone else. Into someone who finally understands that being affected is not the same as being weakened. That allowing someone to matter is not the same as giving them control. That closeness is not automatically danger. That uncertainty is not automatically a reason to leave. And that sometimes the most honest form of courage is simply admitting, this matters to me, you matter to me, and I don't know exactly what comes next. But for once, I don't need to know. I just need to stop pretending I haven't already arrived here, because I have, and so have you. Somewhere between the things we said and the things we didn't, somewhere between the moments that meant nothing to anyone else and the moments that quietly changed everything for me. We crossed a distance neither of us officially acknowledged. There is no timestamp for it. No sentence that marks the beginning. No single memory I can point to and say, there, that was when everything changed. It was slower than that, deeper than that. It was built from details, from the things that should have been forgettable but weren't, from the moments that should have passed but remained, from the strange familiarity of someone who shouldn't have felt familiar. And maybe that is why I trust it, because it wasn't manufactured, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't demanded. It survived without needing to be constantly reinforced. It existed even when nothing was happening. That tells me something. Real things don't always need activity to prove they are alive. Sometimes they exist most clearly in the quiet. And when I think about you now, that is where I find the truth. Not in the noise, not in the dramatic moments, in the quiet, in the pause before a thought, in the moment after a conversation. In the strange feeling that something is missing when I realize I have something I would normally tell you and you aren't there. In the instinct to imagine your perspective. In the comfort of knowing that certain things would not need to be explained twice. Those are the places where I find you, and maybe that is what it means to become part of someone. Not to occupy every moment, to become present in the moments that matter. You did that. You became present in the moments I never expected anyone to enter. And now I understand why the connection feels impossible to categorize. Because it isn't one thing. It is recognition, it is familiarity, it is curiosity, it is trust, it is comfort, it is uncertainty, it is the willingness to remain. It is all of those things existing at once without needing to become one word. Maybe that is enough. Maybe we don't have to reduce something complex into a simple label just because labels make other people comfortable. I don't need that anymore. I know what I know. And what I know is that something between us has changed the architecture of how I see. That is enough truth for me. And if the future asks for more truth, I will answer it when it arrives. But I won't borrow tomorrow's decisions to invalidate today's reality. Today, this is real. Today, you matter today. I understand that. And for the first time, I am not trying to make that understanding smaller. I am letting it exist exactly as it is, exactly as complicated, exactly as unfinished, exactly as honest. Because maybe the most meaningful connections aren't the ones that arrive with certainty. Maybe they're the ones that make you brave enough to stop demanding certainty before you allow yourself to feel what is already true. And if that is what you have done to me, then I think I finally understand why I never walked away. I wasn't waiting for the feeling to disappear. Some part of me was waiting until I became honest enough to admit that I didn't want it to, and now I am. I don't want to go back. I don't want to erase the change. I don't want to pretend you were temporary just because I don't yet know what permanent means. I don't want to turn this into something smaller simply because something larger would require courage. I want to see where honesty takes us, slowly, clearly, without forcing, without pretending. And whatever happens after this, one thing will remain true. You came into my awareness as someone I didn't expect. You became someone I couldn't dismiss. Then someone I trusted, then someone I remembered, then someone I understood. And somewhere along the way, without permission, without announcement, without either of us deciding exactly when it happened, you became part of me, not in the sense of possession, not in the sense of losing myself, in the sense of influence, in the sense of recognition, in the sense that after encountering you, I became slightly different from the person I was before, and perhaps that is the most honest definition I can give. You didn't become my world. You changed the way I see it. You didn't become my identity. You changed the way I understand it. You didn't take away my solitude. You changed what I believe solitude can contain, and you didn't make me dependent. You made me aware that independence and connection were never opposites. They were simply two things I had been keeping unnecessarily separate. Now I know they can coexist. I can remain myself. You can remain yourself. And something meaningful can still exist between us. Maybe that is the real possibility I have been afraid of. Not losing myself in someone, but discovering that I never had to choose between myself and someone else in the first place. You showed me that, and that is why, despite everything I don't know, I am no longer afraid of what I do know. I know you reached me. I know you changed me. I know I allowed it. I know I don't regret it. And I know that whatever comes next, I don't want it to be built on pretending. If there is a next chapter, let it begin with honesty. If there is more distance, let it be honest distance. If there is more closeness, let it be honest closeness. If there is uncertainty, let us call it uncertainty instead of turning it into something false just because false certainty feels safer. I can live with the truth. I think I finally learned how. And the truth is simple now. You became part of the way I understand things. You became part of the way I understand myself. And once someone reaches that place, you don't simply return to who you were before. You carry the recognition forward, quietly, completely, without needing to announce it. That is what I will carry. Not a fantasy, not a promise, not an expectation. Just the undeniable knowledge that somewhere along the way, you reached me without trying, and I let you stay.